Good morning, everyone. So good to be with you. It is the Advent season, and Advent is from the Latin word adventus, which means arrival. But not just the arrival of something, the arrival of something long awaited. And we celebrate in this season that 2,000 years ago, Jesus came into the world. And as I've been reflecting on that, I think, that's a pretty tall order if you're Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, when they have to retell this story, the greatest story in human history. And as they were thinking about, how do we tell this story? They also had to consider, what's the introduction to my biography? Like, what do I need to do to capture my audience's attention? Because that's what any great introduction does, right? I mean, you want to rope your audience in to where you're going. So let me ask you this morning. If you were tasked to retell the greatest story in human history, how would you begin the story? What would you do to get the adrenaline pumping in your audience's blood? What would you do to get them going? I can't wait for what comes next. Well, let me read for you this morning how Matthew chose to answer that question. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Let's switch translation. Perez begat Hezron, Hezron begat Ram, Ram begat Amminadab. It's like, stop the bleeding, right? Like, what a boring beginning to the most epic story in human history. It's like, Matthew, what in the world are you doing? Now, only one other gospel writer included a genealogy, and that was Luke, and he was smart enough not to put this thing up top. It's like, what's going on here? I always find it fascinating when people are like checking out Jesus or they're a recent convert to Jesus and people will say, hey, just start reading the New Testament. Right? It's the first thing they read. I don't think they go, wow, this is exhilarating. I think they go, wow, this is painful. Right? I hope it gets better. And so it's just one of those things that you wrestle with to go, Matthew, what are you doing? This does not seem like a really great introduction. This is the season in which a lot of new films are coming out. For those of you who like going to the movies, like this is probably maybe something you did at Thanksgiving. You're probably doing it in this season. And we've had our own kind of a waiting process for some films that were supposed to be released in 2020 that got pushed to this year. I know for me, one of the films that I was looking forward to seeing was released the first part of October. It was the 5th installment of Daniel Craig as Bond, the last time that he would be playing this role. Any James Bond fans in here? All right, some of you are. If you're not familiar with this series or you don't know it really well, there are like a gazillion films, all right? And most of them actually predate me, so I haven't watched them all. But I have been riveted by these last 5 that have starred Daniel Craig because they took an approach to the opening scene that was just spellbinding. It was their idea was the moment the film opens, we're going to throw you into the action. So in one, Bond is racing around a mountain in a really fast car. In another one, a whole building explodes. In another one, he's on a motorcycle going through the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul. And it's like the moment the film opens, you are like grabbing the edge of your seat and you're like, I am ready to go because they know how to do a James Bond beginning. Matthew, bro, drop the begats and go with a James Bond beginning. You are telling the most epic story in human history. Well, if Matthew's audience heard what I just said, they would say, Brad, you're mistaken. What Matthew has just done is a James Bond beginning. That for these folks in the first century, what Matthew does in the genealogy puts their jaws on the ground and their adrenaline is pumping. And for most of us, we come to the genealogy and we go, let's get to verse 18 when Jesus is about to be born. And we skip right past that genealogy. So here's what I want to do this morning. I want to help us to understand how in the world a boring genealogy is actually a James Bond beginning for the audience in the first century world. And I want you to see the brilliance of what Matthew is doing here, because it's not only brilliant, but I believe it has significant ramifications for us this Christmas season. So that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to tackle a genealogy. You up for that? That's good, because that's what we've got planned, all right? All right, let's begin with who is the audience? Because every single time Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John are sitting down, they're thinking about who is my audience that I'm speaking this message to. Now, most scholars believe that Matthew is actually writing to Antioch. We call it Syrian Antioch or Antioch on the Orontes. We do that to distinguish it because there were 16 Antiochs in the first century, all from the same guy, Antiochus I, because the dude did not have an ego whatsoever. All right? Named all these cities after himself, and so we have to distinguish it. With the Apostle Paul, we've got another Antioch, Pisidian Antioch, but this was actually home base for the Apostle Paul, was this one Antioch on the Orontes. It's where the Christians are first called Christians. Now, when Matthew is writing to this particular city, it's a very, very well-known city. It is the third largest city in the entire Roman Empire, behind Rome and Alexandria. If you were to go there today, this is what you would see. It's all of these homes and buildings in this valley at the base of this giant mountain. And it is like all over the ancient site. Like you just don't see any ruins whatsoever. But we know a lot about this city from the ancient sources. So here's an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like in the first century world. So well north of 250,000, probably somewhere in the 350 to 400,000 range. And this is actually a city that Darren has talked about quite a bit because it was a multi-ethnic city. And when we look at what Matthew has done, Matthew is the most Jewish of the four Gospels. We know that a large percentage of Matthew's audience is Jewish. And that's helpful with what Matthew does in his gospel. Now, in addition to the Jews, if you're not Jewish, you're Gentile. And there is a large contingent of Gentiles part of this Jesus movement in Antioch. And this is who Matthew is writing to. So that's our audience. So I want you to imagine as we go through this genealogy that you are part of that Jesus community. You've got these Jews and you've got these Gentiles, and they're trying to understand the significance of Jesus Christ. Now, Matthew again begins, he says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. Now, the word genealogy here is the Greek word genesis or Genesis, and it means origin, lineage, or family. So I love this. It starts off with, this is the genesis of Jesus. This is his genealogy. This is the origin. This is the lineage. This is the family. And this is why this would have been so exhilarating for the people in the first century, particularly the Jewish people, because the Jewish people validated one's identity through their lineage. That's where your heritage is. That's your inheritance stream. That's your legitimacy. That is your rights. They are all bound up in your genealogy. And so this is Matthew saying, let me help you to understand the identity of Jesus and his heritage, because with identity comes calling. You get a sense for what did Jesus come to do? Why is this so significant? And so when Matthew begins, he says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And there you go. He just framed for you what he is going to do in this genealogy. He says, I'm going to help you to understand who Jesus is in this genealogy framed through the son of David and the son of Abraham. So let's start with the son of David. Who is David in Scripture? He's the most beloved king in Israelite history. He was the second monarch behind Saul. He was called a man after God's own heart. Now, at the end of David's life, he wants to build a temple to God, a house for the Lord. And God, through the court prophet Nathan, says, hey, I know what you want to do, but it's actually not going to be you who does that. And what's more, I'm doing something bigger than you can possibly imagine, David. Let's look at this passage. It's from 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 through 13. This is through Nathan speaking to to David. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. David didn't ask for that. That's a big bonus right there. Solomon will build the house of the Lord, but God is promising an everlasting kingdom through the heritage of David. Now, this was a huge promise from God. And this is roughly 1000 BC that God gives this. And so from generation to generation, they are talking about this Davidic covenant, this promise from God to David to establish this everlasting kingdom. And so we wonder, okay, how does that get played out? Because we see it over and over and over again. I want to just show you an example from what we read during this Christmas season. It's from Isaiah chapter 9. Notice the language here. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This is about the one who is to come. Notice the next verse. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So now we are a few hundred years later, and God is speaking through the prophet Isaiah to affirm this promise will be fulfilled. There is a coming Messiah. There is one who is going to inaugurate God's everlasting kingdom. And everybody is anticipating this and going, this is fantastic, this is amazing. And then they hit the exile. And everything just plummeted. And when it comes to the time of the exile, because after David, you have Solomon. After Solomon, you have a divided kingdom. The northern is Israel, southern is Judah. Northern kingdom gets taken out in 722 BC by the Assyrians. And the Babylonians knock the Assyrians off to rule the world. They come into the southern kingdom of Judah, conquer them in 605 BC, and it starts the exile to Babylon. There will be 4 deportations, but the first one is in 605. Among them, Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, Daniel is enlisted into the court of the king of Babylon, a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. And in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that nobody can interpret. And Daniel steps in and says, I will give you the interpretation, but it's not me. This is of God. And Daniel says, Nebuchadnezzar, you had a dream. You saw a statue that has 4 metals, gold, silver, bronze, and iron. And it's also got some clay mixed in. And Daniel says, this is of the 4 kingdoms that are to come, beginning with your kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar, of Babylon. Now, what Daniel doesn't do is say, okay, then it's going to be Medo-Persia and then Greece and then Rome. But as history unfolds, the prophecy of Daniel is crystal clear who these nations are that he was prophesying about. Because then the Persians come, and then the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and then finally the Romans are ruling the world, and the Romans have the world under their control at the time of Jesus' birth. Now, after Daniel lays this out to Nebuchadnezzar, get what happens in verse 44. Daniel says this, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. So when they are in the pit of despair, when they are in exile going, God, what in the world are you doing? How could you allow this to happen to us? God, through Daniel, says, I am working in the midst of these world events to take the plan towards my sovereign goal. Daniel, hang in there. People, hang in there. Because when Rome hits the world stage, watch out, because my kingdom is coming at that point. And so when Matthew begins and says, this is the genealogy, this is the genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, and says, the son of David, everybody is going, is this it? Is this the time? Is this the one we've been waiting for? And Matthew goes, yes, and I'm going to prove it through the genealogy. And so we go, well, how in the world is he doing this through a genealogy? Well, for that, I need to invite you to please stand with me. And if you are new to Church of the City, as is our custom, typically every Sunday at some point during the sermon, we either listen or read a passage together as a community as we stand in the presence of the reading of God's word. So for this morning, I would like for all of us to read these two verses together. And this is the end of the genealogy. This is now the introduction of Joseph and Mary. And notice what Matthew records as we read this aloud. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus, there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. The word of the Lord, thanks be to God. You may be seated. Thank you for joining me in that. So here's what's super cool about Matthew and his genealogies. He at least gives you a heads up of where he's going, son of David, son of Abraham. And then he gets through the genealogy and he says, hey, notice there were 14 generations. And he gives us these blocks from Abraham to David, David to the exile, exile to the Messiah, and he includes the 14 with each one of these sets. Now, if you were to go back into the Hebrew scriptures and look at all the names that Matthew has included in the genealogy, you would find Matthew has left a couple of names out. Now, why is he doing that? Well, this was a very Jewish thing to do. It was the genealogy that proved one's identity. And so if you had to leave a couple of people out in order for you to make your point, that was perfectly acceptable in the Jewish world. Now, you hear that this morning, and for some of us in our 21st century Western mindset, we go, that feels like Matthew has made a mistake. I don't like that. Listen, don't impose upon the Bible what the Bible does not impose upon itself. This is very typical in Jewish culture to do this with a genealogy. So the question becomes then, why does he leave a couple of people out in order to have nice 14, 14, and 14? What's Matthew's deal with 14? I don't know about you, but I've never heard of a lucky 14. Okay? Now, some people will go, well, 7 is a really important number in the Bible, and it is, and 7 times 2 is 14. Yes, that is correct math and multiplication, but I think that there is a more significant reason why Matthew is interested in telling you 14, 14, 14. And it centers around something called gematria. Let me hear you say gematria. Gematria is a Hebrew word, and it carries this idea of assigning numerical value to letters to derive meaning from words, names, and phrases. Numerology. And with the Hebrew language, the first letter has a numerical value of 1. The second letter has a numerical value of 2. That goes all the way up to 10. And then at the 11th one, you start going by increments of 10. That's how you get the numerology of Hebrew. Now, for some of you, you may go, well, that sounds like Jewish mysticism, Middle Ages kind of stuff. It is, but this whole idea of gematria goes way back. In fact, we have evidence more than 700 years before the time of Jesus that this was part of culture. Here's one of our earliest examples. It is in connection to Assyrian King Sargon II. He ruled in the last part of the 8th century BC, and we have an inscription that states that the king built the wall of Khorsabad, which was his capital city, 16,283 cubits long, to correspond with the numerical value of his name. Again, 700 years before the time of Jesus. So Matthew seems to be really interested in David, so let's look at David for a moment. Now, in Hebrew, there are no vowels. There's 22 consonants, there are no vowels. We hear vowel sounds, but there are no vowels. So David's name is spelled DVD, all right? And in Hebrew, it is Dalet Vav Dalet. And the Dalet has a numerical value of 4. The Vav has a 6. 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals? You are on it today. Well done. It's 14. You go, that's interesting. Is that just convenient? Or is Matthew actually centering the heritage around David? Well, there's one other piece of evidence that seems to confirm that when he's doing 14, 14, 14, he wants to draw our attention to David. And that's with the listing of all the kings. In the genealogy, there are 15 kings that are listed. But who's the only one who's designated as king? It's David. They're all kings. And yet Matthew says, King David. And when you go back and you look at this, you go, okay, if you follow this from Abraham to David, which Matthew has lined up, you go, oh, this is the origin and the rise of the Davidic kingdom. And then you go from David to the exile, and it's the decay and downfall of the Davidic kingdom. The whole thing is in the ashes. Hope has been obliterated. People are in despair. There is a longing of someone to come to actually be the fulfillment of God's promises. And then Matthew says, yeah, but then from the exile to the Messiah, this is the restoration of the Davidic covenant. And as this first century audience is hearing the genealogy, and then they hear Matthew framing it at the end, what they hear clearly is that Jesus, the Messiah, was the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant for the Jews. And for these folks, 1,000 years God has promised to make good on his word. And when Jesus enters onto the stage, God is fulfilling his promise. The hopes and dreams of all the years are met with thee tonight. We understand that, don't we? This longing, this hope, this anticipation. We want God to act in a way that we want God to do something that we've been longing for. And it was in this genealogy that those who are sitting in the synagogue or in the cave off in the hills, they're listening to Matthew's story of Jesus, and the Jewish people are going, God made good on his word. And they were celebrating that Jesus was the fulfillment, because that meant God's everlasting kingdom was underway and the king had been birthed into the world. Now, this is for the Jewish people would have picked up on this. And what's interesting is that Matthew doesn't say, well, he's just a son of David. Matthew goes, no, he's a son of David. He's also a son of Abraham. David makes sense. But what's going on with Abraham here? Well, we got to go back into our story and just ask the same question as we did before with David, which is, who is Abraham? Well, Abraham shows up in Genesis, our first book of the Bible. Genesis 1 and 2, God is creating a good world, a world of shalom, wholeness, well-being. Everything is as God intends it to be. Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 take from the tree, and sin and death and brokenness and pain and chaos come screaming into God's good world, and everything is shattered. And what we see of God in Genesis is that God doesn't look on the broken pieces and say, well, let's just scrap that and start over. God goes, I'm going to put the whole thing back together. And where this redemptive story really takes off is when God comes to a man by the name of Abram in Genesis 12, whose name will be later called Abraham, and God makes a promise of what he's going to do through Abraham's descendants for the entire world. Notice these famous words, Genesis 12, 2-3. God says this, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, the people were trying to figure out what does the application of this look like, but what we can see in God's promise to Abraham is that God's redemptive story was never intended just to be for the Jewish people alone. It's that God was saying, I am going to bless them, and through them, I am going to bless the entire world. It was always about the whole world. And so when Matthew then reminds his audience that Jesus is a son of Abraham, we've got to do the same thing and ask, so how in the world is he depicting this in the genealogy? And the answer is with the women. Because here's the thing. You don't include women in a genealogy in the ancient world. One's heritage was seen through men. It was paternal. For those of you who know about Judaism today, modern day Judaism, you trace your lineage maternally through your mother, but in the ancient world, it was always through your father. So there was no reason to include women, especially because women did not hold high social standing in the ancient world. And yet, Matthew has women in this genealogy. Now, the one that actually makes sense is Mary, because Joseph is not Jesus's biological father, and Matthew's got to go on and try to explain that in the verses coming. Imagine trying to explain that one, right? And so what we have here is we've got Mary, so she makes sense. So let's just set her aside because her inclusion is helpful because the Holy Spirit has impregnated her and that's how Jesus is coming into the world. You get all of that. But when you look at these other four, you go, Matthew, what are you doing here? Because here's the thing. If you did include women in a genealogy, you would include matriarchs. And in this storyline, Abraham's wife is Sarah. Isaac's wife is Rebecca. You've got Jacob's wives, Rachel, Leah. Like you would expect them to be in here. They're not in there. So we come to the genealogy, and if you know your Hebrew scriptures, you go, okay, Matthew left a couple of people out. Nobody would have thought anything of it. But the fact that Matthew included these women, this would have been like sirens going off, going, Matthew, what are you doing? And then you go and you look and you go, oh, Tamar is a Canaanite. She's Gentile. Rahab is a Canaanite. She's Gentile. Ruth is a Moabitess. She's Gentile. Now, we don't know the ethnicity of Uriah's wife, who is Bathsheba, but Uriah is a Hittite, and Hittite land is modern-day Turkey. He was a foreigner, and so people posit the possibility that Bathsheba was also a Gentile. Now, imagine that you are in this first century church in Antioch. And you know that the promises God has made have been through the Jewish people. That's where the Messiah was going to come. That's where the everlasting kingdom was going to happen. God was going to work through the Jewish people. But you find out about Jesus and you are compelled by him. And you're like, I wonder what part I have to play. Am I able to be part of this? And Matthew says, here's the good news about Jesus. He's a son of David. He's also a son of Abraham because Jesus, the Messiah, was the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant for all people. And Matthew was reminding them, God made a promise 2,000 years prior to a man by the name of Abraham and said, through your descendants, I will bless them to bless the whole world. Jesus came from within Judaism, not just for the Jewish people, but for all people. And the Gentiles are sitting there going, I get to be part of the story as well. Now, let's take this one step deeper, because this is where it really connects for me personally, and I believe for you as well in the midst of this Advent Christmas season. Is that when we go back and we look at these women, it's not just the fact that Matthew included women who were Gentiles, because they were part of his story. Matthew's not adding anybody that wasn't part of Jesus' heritage. These women are all connected to Jesus' heritage, but the fact that Matthew highlights them draws our attention to them. It's not that they're just Gentile. It's that they also have shady backgrounds. All right? Tamar seduces her father-in-law, Judah, to have intercourse with her. She gets pregnant with twins, and both of those boys are listed in the genealogy. Rahab is a prostitute from Jericho. Mommy, Daddy, what's a prostitute? Y'all can have that conversation in the minivan ride home, all right? Power to the minivan conversations, all right? Ruth is an honorable woman. She's from Moab. And the Moabites did something to the Israelites when they were coming into the promised land, so much so that the Moabites were excluded from the assembly of God because of what they did. Uriah's wife is Bathsheba. Now, why she's not listed as Bathsheba, I don't know. But I think that what's going on here is to remind you, she was the wife of another man. She committed adultery with David. And you look at this and you go, there is baggage and there is brokenness in these women's lives and in their heritage. Yep. And it's not just the women. It's also the dudes as well. Chief among them, King David. He commits adultery with Bathsheba. She gets pregnant. David tries to cover it up, has her husband Uriah murdered. You go deep into David's family, there is lying, betrayal, murder within the family. David goes to his deathbed handing his son Solomon a hit list. A man after God's own heart? On which planet? And yet that's precisely the point. That when you look at this family heritage of Jesus, everyone has brokenness in their story. There are high points and there are low points, and here's the thing I love about the Bible. The Bible includes both. That there are no sacred cows in the sacred scripture. The Word of God just presents it in all of its humanness, all of its brokenness, all of its rawness. And what's so compelling to me about how Matthew has structured this genealogy is that he is helping us all to see, not just the Jews and the Gentiles getting this in the first century, but those of us sitting here at COTC Franklin or watching online 2,000 years later, is that there is something about Jesus' family that helps us. And that's this, that Jesus emerges from a family line of brokenness in order to bring hope, rescue, and restoration to all people, Jews and Gentiles alike. This is the story of Christmas. This is the genealogy of Christmas. This is why we gather and celebrate in the midst of the season, because this is us. This is our story. That we needed someone to bring rescue and hope and redemption and restoration to the brokenness in our own lives. And one of the things that I've been trying to do this Christmas season is that it's been a hard season for a lot of people. It's been a hard year. I mean, let's all be honest. We were sitting in these chairs or maybe watching online a year ago going, let's kiss 2020 goodbye and let's never go back. And nobody thought, or very few people did, that a whole year later we'd be sitting here going, and let's do that for 2021 as well. Is that we find ourselves in the midst of a challenging season. And I know for me that when things aren't going well, it's easy to focus on all the things that aren't going well, rather than going, okay, I do need to give voice to those things that aren't going well, but in a season like this, I don't want to lose the gratitude for why Jesus came in the first place, in order to rescue and redeem us from our brokenness and our sin and our pain. And that maybe for some of us this morning, we just needed to be reminded of what we can be grateful for in the season. Because in the midst of challenging circumstances, sometimes it's just in the midst of lots that's going on. Maybe it's parties, it's presents, it's gifts, it's all these other things that are going on. And it's like, this is why we celebrate this season, is that 2,000 years ago, Jesus came in order to set us free. And that's worth celebrating. Wouldn't you agree? Now, you can clap about that. But here's the other thing that I would just say on the heels of that, is that it's not only that Jesus emerges from that kind of a family, it's that Jesus' family heritage reminds us that everyone is welcome to be part of God's family, no matter how messed up our past or our present may be. It's like at Christmas time, God opens up his cosmic arms and he says, I am sending my son because I so love the world. And that for many people in a season like this, where we're celebrating the goodness of Jesus coming, there's also an awareness of where we may be still experiencing brokenness in our own lives. And having grown up in a church culture, I know how easy it is to kind of get this narrative going that, okay, I'm a follower of Jesus, and yet I'm still struggling with something really significant. To feel a sense of shame, to feel a sense of, well, I just got to get my act together, and then I'll be okay with God, or then I'll invite God into my story. 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked into the chaos of the world to deal with the chaos of the world. This is a God who wants to be invited into the midst of the chaos, not for us to get to a point that we've removed enough chaos to now feel like God's going to be okay with us. And that for maybe some of you today, you are in the midst of something in your own life, in your own story, where you just need to be reminded this morning that God works in the midst of people's brokenness, that God wants to be invited into the midst of our brokenness, because this is a God who does the work that we need done, that we are unable to do on our own. And I would plead with you this Christmas season that if you are struggling, nobody knows, you haven't brought it into the light. I know it's the Christmas season. We're supposed to be happy and joyous and all this stuff. Listen, if you are experiencing chaos and brokenness in your own life, even if other people don't know, it's impacting them. That this is the season that we are reminded, this is why Jesus came in the first place. You cannot get to the cross without Christmas. Christmas is the precursor to getting to the cross. And Jesus came precisely because we needed someone to save us from the very thing that we could not save ourselves from. Let somebody in on what's going on. Get the help that you need. May this be a season that you look back and say, 2,000 years later, Jesus came and saved me anew. And I would also just offer this up to those of you who are here this morning who aren't a follower of Jesus. A lot of people during the Christmas season are just checking it out. They hear all the music and they start wondering, is there actually more to this? Should I give thought to this again? And you may be watching online, you may be here. Christmas is a reminder that anyone is welcomed to be part of the family of Jesus Christ. And there is no greater decision you will ever make in life than choosing to accept that this story is true, that Jesus is for you and he's done something for you and he wants to do something in your life. And if that's something that you want to make a decision on, to consider further, listen, we've got people up here afterwards. We've got a prayer room in the back. We would love to talk with you. If a friend or a neighbor or even family invited you, they'd love to tell you how what Jesus has done in their life has completely changed the trajectory of their soul. Because this is a time of year where we remember what Jesus Christ has done for us. It's a season of Advent, of longing for something long anticipated, of being reminded that 2,000 years ago, God took on flesh and blood, was birthed into a little village of Bethlehem for you and for me. And that as we continue to celebrate this Advent season, I know that there are longings and hopes and anticipations in all of us that God would meet us anew this season. And I pray that that would be true for you.